Previously on agentpalmer.com, Spyline and the Case of the Missing Agent Palmer book review. It all begins with a song sings praises of the creative process, and since the journalist conversation with Sky, I'm leaning towards calling myself a features writer and documentary conversationalist. This is the Palmer Files, episode 57, featuring Sam Leiterman, a mathematician and teacher who came on to discuss math, and we do, before taking a left turn to talk about books, literature, young adult novels, engineering, divergent paths, and much, much more. Are you ready? Let's do the show! Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 57th episode is Sam Leiterman, whose path towards math appears to mirror my path to communications, as you'll soon hear. The discussion is as chaotic as you have come to expect from this podcast. We start with my asking Sam why math, and then take a left turn from whiteboards full of equations solving for X to the library full of books. We talk about math because Sam is a mathematician, but we also talk about following a passion, challenging yourself, the road not taken, reading and reading patterns, young adult literature, abstract algebra, teaching, Twitch, and so much more. Now, before we get going, remember that if you want to discuss this episode as you listen or afterwards, you can tweet me at Agent Palmer, my guest Sam at Sam Leiterman, that's SamLeitermann, and this show at The Palmer Files. You can watch Sam along with John on Twitch at The Math Profs at twitch.tv/TheMathProfs, that's PROFS. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com, and remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. So without further ado, let's start to solve for X, and don't forget to show your work. Sam, you not only probably learned more math than I ever did, but you kept choosing to go to higher education and continue to learn math. I am astounded by this, and I'm slightly jealous. So, first off, why math?
It's a great question, and maybe circle back to choosing to go higher. Math gives you insight into understanding so many different venues of the world. And I think a major mistake that folks can make is to believe that math is sort of this neutral subject, that it sits analytically above everything else, because that's absolutely not true. It's just not a fact. But I feel like I have insights into physics because I understand the math behind it. And I have insights into political forecasting because I understand the math behind it. It's such a powerful tool to analyze and to put your hands onto things that that feel unknowable or that feel very hard to know. And so I love it for that reason. That's kind of the first thing, right? It feels useful and meaningful. But there's also, there's a portion of it that is just about math is beautiful in and of itself. It's got this sense of connection to itself that I don't see in a lot of places. A good example, I'm teaching linear algebra right now, and students often ask me questions like, what does it mean for a vector to have this property? And I have to sit there and go, well, which meaning do you want? That's a contextual answer, right? It depends on, if I'm thinking about this type of math, it involves this thing. And if I'm thinking about this type of math, it involves this thing. And that sense of connection is really valuable, and maybe is the reason why I kept looking.
So I understand that. I expect, unless we actually start getting into very, very high math, you will not lose me. Unlike the educational system, because for me, I think I have and continue to have that analytical brain that you need to function within mathematics, right? It's not just memorization, because I feel like that's a part of, and we're not gonna get on the educational diatribe here, but like for me, one of the things that was always amazing was, yeah, whether you had the math teacher that was going to let you look at the book or not, like, or you had to memorize it or whatever, there were people that just simply looked at the equation, even if they had an open book test, and went, I don't understand this. That was never my problem. My problem was I had a much better English teacher in 8th grade, and my entire focus shifted from math and science to the arts, right? You lost me as a potential engineer or physicist, two subjects I have great interest in still, but you lost me along that path by having a stronger English teacher in 8th grade, because it shifted my direction in that regard. But I understand how important it is. And this is why I'm interested in like the potential for you choosing math as a subject, because, at a certain point, and I've been trying to read more. And so I read all about, things I enjoy, right? And trying to get out there. But I've read a little bit about World War II. I've read a lot about NASA and the moonshot. And the math that they're doing in the 60s is math that I can understand. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, it's just not complicated to me. But I understand that's not everyone. So math might have been one of my favorite subjects up until 8th grade. So I guess we'll start here. Was it one of your favorite subjects?
It is, though. I had higher SAT verbal scores than math scores, and that this was a question that came up in my college interview. Why are you pursuing this degree instead of writing or something? But I always have loved it. I've loved it since the moment that I stepped into an Algebra 1 high school classroom in 8th grade. So 8th grade is really where I got hooked. It's interesting that this is a distinction for us, because I got to go to a high school math class in my 8th grade year, and I spent time in that classroom with people that were much bigger than me, certainly physically, but got to begin to see the beauty of, I love algebra, right? The beauty of kind of manipulation of symbols and how did that work? And I really have, that love has kind of extended through. I'm really fortunate that I had good teachers, and teachers that really commanded a love of mathematics and made it feel real and valuable. And I know that that's not something that everyone has gotten. And so I feel so lucky to do that. I got a C in pre-calculus in my junior year. I absolutely could have decided that I was not going to pursue math, but I loved it. And even that teacher who gave me that C, which I totally deserved in hindsight, I appreciate and really still instilled that love for me. So it really has been lifelong.
Trigonometry, I think, may be the highest, academic level of math I've ever studied, I guess. Because full disclosure, I skipped my senior year to go to college, which was not necessarily a function of me being super smart, as just a situational thing. But I had trig the first half of my junior year of high school, which is right before I went overseas for a semester abroad, where I continued trigonometry. I don't remember a math when I skipped my senior year and was enrolled in college. In fact, my entire career, 4 years of higher education at a college, I took algebra. I think I just took algebra, and then like a science and a science, because it was another math science elective. So I got away with getting away from it. And I think, and I know I'm saying this again, but I feel like it's important. I think that the fact that I lost interest It's not that I couldn't do it. I'm sure if I put my mind to it, I could do it today and just pick up those books and study. But I lost interest. And to me, and while 8th grade's critical, I never got it back, right? Like I never, even like I've read physics books because physics books are great philosophy books, which is a part of math that I'm sure we'll talk about, but I never fell back in. I love the philosophy of it. I really do. I love the analytical nature of it. I like predictions and probabilities and, game theory. And I went for a run this afternoon, okay? And like every, former athlete, I definitely compare myself to 20 years ago. And so I know I'm running slower, but I still like to keep my paces up. And I do the math in my head that the first half mile was at a 7.5 minute pace. The first mile was at an 8-minute pace. So clearly the second half mile was 8.5. Like I do that math in my head while I'm running. Why? I have I could be doing anything else with my time, right? I'm doing the math on my splits in my head. So I understand that I could do it. But, and you've been there. So this is my question. Do you feel like in hindsight, you needed the love, the interest, the passion for math to keep going, right? Because obviously that's where it feels like our roads diverged.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think I did, and I think that this is it's a place where the system really treated me well, and it fails a lot of kids. It's a reason I left actually the collegiate world for the high school world. This really meaningful moment where we can lose people or gain people. And for me, the ability of my teachers to keep coming to the table, to keep making it relevant and meaningful to me was a reason that I kept persevering. One of my favorite writers says people don't stick to things just because they're good at sticking to things. They stick to things because they care about them,
yes.
right? Because they're meaningful.
Sure, yeah.
And so the calculation of your splits is meaningful to you. You care about it because it has meaning. I mean, because you're comparing yourself to something, right? There's a meaning there for you. And I think that sense of meaning or value that was brought is the reason I stuck to it. I certainly didn't stick to it just because, at least in my opinion, maybe I don't know myself very well, that there was like innately something that called me to it. I'm a pretty good writer. I love history, right? There's lots of reasons why I could have gone in a very different direction and chose not to. And so it rings true to me that there are folks that continued to show that value to me, that kept me on that path.
Yeah. One of the things that I regret actually is not sticking with it. Like, I know I just said like passion would have helped me persevere, but my uncle always told me, and still to this day tells me, like, the world needs engineers who can write. Like, don't go to school for writing if you can write, because all the teaching in the world is not going to make you a better writer. Writing, unfortunately, hot take, writing is kind of an instinct. You either have it, like, you can work to get better, but I was never going to run a 4-minute mile, right? I was never going to, I could work myself down to sub 6 when I was a teenager, but I was never going to run a 4-minute mile. It just wasn't going to happen. There are people that just will never be able to write, and that's fine. But if you already know how to write, go learn something else. And I was idealistic. I was like, but I want to take the arts classes, right? Like I went where the passion was. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I do have that little, like, not little, I do have that what if that's like, well, I everything I'm doing now I could have done. Like, none of this changes. I just have a better fundamental understanding of math, right? Or a more advanced understanding of math. So do you have like a what if the opposite? Like, are you literally my my opposite doppelganger? Like, am I looking in a mirror of somebody who's like, oh, I should have done writing?
So I don't know if this was my last class. One of my last classes of my undergraduate, I was in a freshman English class. So weird scenario, I transferred between my sophomore and junior years of college. And so I had this weird amalgamation of credits that got me 2 years, but it got me 2 years in like a very strange way. And all my core courses I hadn't taken, at least according to the university that I transferred to. So I ended up in my very last semester of college. I was a senior. I was, I think, 22. I might have been 21 at the time in this freshman English class, entirely out of place, right? And so I go to the last class and I take this final, and I had turned in this paper, and this paper was on Frankenstein, Waiting for Godot, and The Tempest, and man's search for meaning and loneliness. Right? It was a really fun paper to write. I still remember writing this paper, and my English teacher caught me outside my door as I left my final, and he said, "Where are you going after this?" And I said, "I'm going to grad school," as I had already gotten in at that point, and I knew what I was going to do. And he said, "For writing?" And I said, "No, I'm going for math. I'm doing a PhD in mathematics." And he said, "If you ever decide to change your mind, call me. I'll write you a recommendation letter." And I had a degree in math. Like I was not qualified, at least in my eyes, for a PhD in writing. But I will say that there are times, I mean, I have an intense love of literature. I read often. I read at least 100 books a year. That's like my baseline goal. I write often. I have an intense love of this. And I do occasionally wonder what would happen if I had taken him up on that offer, right? If I had decided to change my entire direction in that moment. Yeah, it definitely is a question I have sometimes.
So what are you reading? Because you're busy, right? You have a job, you have a career, you have kids and a family, and you're making time to read, which to me is always the important. I read approximately 60 to 75 books a year, give or take. And I usually sometimes take like a week off or 2 weeks off and I'm not going to read. But, I had to set aside the time to be like, reading is going to be a priority. I don't get to talk to a lot of readers. And I don't mean that to put anyone down. Everyone's busy. And it's immensely easier to turn on a screen. It doesn't matter what you're consuming. That's just, it doesn't. But I'm always curious as to what you're reading, because I read my interests, but I have learned over the course of stubbornness that I can read anything, right? So I have chosen specific authors that I am reading bibliographies of. So Len Dayton, I'm reading through his bibliography, and while he did write, the Ipcris File, which gives me the movie starring Michael Caine, which gives me Agent Palmer, and he, wrote a series of 10 books with Bernard Sampson, he also wrote a lot of nonfiction. So currently, right now, I'm reading about World War II again, because he wrote a bunch of books on World War II, and my whole thing of, well, I'm going to read every book in the order it was published means that before I can get to the last trilogy of the Samson verse, so to speak, I have to read this book. And Douglas Copeland and Clive Barker and Terry Brooks, there are authors where I'm just I'm reading all of your stuff. And so this has put me in an interesting spot, because I'm now not just reading, well, I really like NASA. How many biographies of the original astronauts can I get my hands on? Or I really like music. Who's got a good, the Dylan book was fun. I read a book on Zappa. So it's not just that. I have learned, I can go out of my comfort zone. And when I finish these authors, because I have this elaborate, math might actually help me in this, because I get this elaborate, I read a fiction, and then a nonfiction, and a fiction, and a nonfiction. But I also try and mix up my authors. So I don't read so it's Dayton, and then maybe a nonfiction, and then maybe a middle fiction that's not related to it. Like it's the weird patterns that I've tried to create for myself. But when you make an effort and you go like, I'm going to read, like then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I finished a book. I finished another book. I finished a book. I finished another book. So all of that is to say, like, what are you reading? Because clearly you're someone who, like me, can go after anything, really.
Yeah, so right now I'm reading the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan.
Okay.
A fan. We share a love, by the way, of Clive Barker and of Terry Brooks. I have been a fantasy fan for a long time. I read Tolkien when I was very young, and sort of have read much of the canon, and had never read Wheel of Time. And Amazon's coming out with a TV series, right? So it felt like the right time. But I also end up in the same problem that you end up in, which is I got to about book 5 of Wheel of Time, and I was like, I can't read another Robert Jordan book. It's not going to work out. I've just I've read 5 of them in a row. And I like them, and I just can't manage it. So I've worked really hard to sort of vary my my reading. So I also I do educational research, so I keep up on that, and it feels like there's a book published sort of every week. Though I try to be a little bit discriminating about those choices. I also sometimes just look at the New York Times bestseller list and choose a book that feels like I wouldn't normally choose it.
Okay.
And just try to get like a sense of, because I think I can find myself going back to the well, going back to the like, this is a fantasy series. It's like most of the other fantasy series that I know. Like, I'm just going to read the new Brandon Sanderson book, which, don't get me wrong, love Brandon Sanderson. Very excited when he releases books. But it does help me break out of that into some piece of fiction or some drama that I wouldn't normally read. That is, lovely, and often I find things that I do love that I wouldn't otherwise have read.
Yeah, recently, and I've talked about this on the show, but I've also not really gone in depth. But like, I've been purging my house, just trying. I was a pack rat for way too long of my life, really, and it's just like I'm done. And what I found now is, outside of an overabundance of magic cards that I just cannot seem to get rid of, is books are my weakness. But I haven't read all of them. So for me, outside of maybe finishing the Dayton collection or finishing the Copeland collection or maybe fixing a few... Because I went on the Barker front, I was like, I think I want to slowly get all of these in hardcover, because when I did the Dayton collection, they're all hardcover. You can't always get first editions, but they're hardcover, right? And the Dayton collection was fun because I put it up on eBay like as an alert, and it was like, it pings you and you're like, all right, this is exciting. Like, oh, do I have this one? Do I not? Like the Barker one I put up on eBay because the Dayton one was done. And I got a ping on like a collection of like 14 hardcovers within like the first week I put it up. And I did the math, and it ended up being like super good. Like, this is worth doing. So I did it. I was like, all right, that's fine. And I didn't realize how much he wrote. Like, I knew he was prolific, and I had read not a lot, but I'd read what I thought was a lot. And it's like, no, you haven't. Like, I have a collection of Dayton behind me. Okay. It's 40 books, right? You don't realize what 40 books looks like till it takes up 2 bookshelves, right? Like, it's just, okay. Right. And Barker, it's not the same way. Like, I don't have Weave World in hardcover yet. The others, a bunch of the other ones I do. And the Terry Brooks, by the way, I have in the hardcover omnibuses of the Shannara series, which, funny story on that. If you want to be a reader, like Sam and I are talking about, right? Like, you sit down and you read, do not get an omnibus. Okay. So I will tell you, I have a digital Kindle copy of the first Sword of Shannara omnibus because I was halfway through book 1 when I got food poisoning, and I was so tired and weak, I couldn't hold up the book to continue reading, but I really wanted to continue reading because I'm sick. So what else am I going to do? So I ended up buying it on Kindle, right? So that but it is this weird thing where I'm like, all right, now I've got all these books and I've got these collections, but I'm done because I have books that I've held on to. So going back to the whole I'm getting rid of stuff, well, I'm not the kind of person that's just going to get rid of it. I need to know, like, okay, time to read this book that I've moved from, somebody bought me a long time ago, that I moved from my parents' house to my apartment to now my house. Or maybe there were a couple moves that, like, these books, I've picked these books up. I've put them in boxes. I've taken them out of, like, they've followed me. Why do I have this book, right? And so some of these books have been wonderful surprises. Like, I'm so glad I held on to that. There are definitely some that I'm not looking forward to. But again, in getting out of your comfort zone, and I've been very lucky, just like you, I've read one book. Okay? Because I'm a completionist, so I have to finish it, but I hated every page of it. It's the one bad review on my entire blog. Good luck finding it. Because it's years old now. So that's your one hint. But I'm kind of excited to read some of the random stuff I've kind of collected or absorbed somehow into my library over the years. But just looking around, like, because I don't have a library. My house isn't massive, so I've got a bookshelf here, a bookshelf there, right? And I keep all my datings together. You try and be organized, but there's a massive amount of religious texts that I have to figure out what I'm going to do with. Because once you start collecting, especially Jewish literature, it multiplies on you somehow. So I don't know how that's all going to shape out, but I'm not going to get rid of it. I'm going to read it first. And so I know I've got some of that ahead of me, but I keep stalling it. Have you read everything in your house? Let me, start there.
I have not read everything in my house. And I will say I am more than willing to bail out of a book if I get, halfway through it. And, in my opinion, I've only got a finite amount of books that I'm able to read in my life. So finishing one that I absolutely hate, not really on my list of things to do most of the time, though I did finish Atlas Shrugged, and I did hate approximately every page of that book. But I felt like it at least, it helped me understand some things about the world that we live in these days,
sure,
which is useful. I certainly haven't read everything in my house. I've read a lot of it.
Okay.
There are weird books that are on my shelf that I'm really actually not sure where they came from. I just, I'm sure that they were accumulated somewhere, somehow, through some friend. Someone gave them to me. And there's a bunch of those. And like you, I sort of I look at them and I say, I should definitely read you.
Yeah.
Many of them are kind of in my genre. They're like in the kind of set of things that I read. So I'd probably enjoy you. And then, inevitably my attention gets attracted elsewhere. And so it's a concerted effort. And I've gotten through some of them, right? Like in sometimes I've just made a concerted effort of this book has existed in my life for a long time and I should go do something about that. But some of them just kind of float. They just kind of exist. And that's that continues to work. I will say the other thing that I've been successful at is sometimes I give books that I love away to people that I care about, or to students. So one of my favorite things to do with students that graduate that I've had a relationship with, that we've been close, is to give them a favorite book. So Frank Herbert's Estate must love me because I must have bought 12 copies of Dune at this point. It's one of my favorite books. But I've met a lot of students who should read Dune. So I write something in the front cover for them and I give it to them. And that has thinned my book collection a little bit.
Okay.
For books that I sort of know that I'm not going to reread, or I'll just buy another copy if I do end up rereading them. I feel like it's meaningful. Like it's going to someone who will care for it.
Yeah. I've actually only lent one book out that I didn't get back. And I considered this particular book a mitzvah of sorts because it was Duff McKagan's first autobiography. I think his first autobiography. I don't know if he wrote a second one. I know he wrote a second book. I don't know what that book is. And his first book was all about recovery. He talks about, growing up in the Northwest and, playing all of the instruments and then migrating to LA and getting into Guns N' Roses. But the book really picks up and really focuses on him waking up and needing to go to the hospital and the recovery aspect. And so I lent it to a friend who finished it and lent it to a friend of his who was going through recovery. And so I didn't get it back, but I feel like I did okay if that book even kind of remotely helped that other guy. Now, my collection's incomplete because I got Slash, I got Axel, and I don't have Duff. But it's okay because I feel like I kind of, maybe. I hope it helped. I don't know, but...
Right. Well, and that's the power of, at least for me, right? That's the power of literature, is when I can see myself in either the story of another real person, right, nonfiction books, or the story of a fictional person, and I can work out the very real like feelings and emotions and experiences that I'm having, right? That's when a book grips me, right? When I can feel myself in that character. So yeah, like hopefully that person could at least see their journey through that and hopefully get maybe even a little bit of hope because they're seeing the story of recovery, right? What a cool experience.
I want to ask you, have you ever cried reading a book?
Yes,
okay.
I have.
Nonfiction or fiction?
Fiction.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I have not cried at fiction, but I have cried at nonfiction, which is a testament. Look, he was a guest on this show. Okay. Brian J. Jones, biographer. He did George Lucas. Mm-hmm. He did Dr. Seuss, which I haven't read yet, but he did Henson. And I don't know if it's the way he happened to write that chapter or not, but even though it's coming, like even if you don't know Henson, like at a certain point everything stops and it's because there is no more Jim. It's coming and it's building and you start reading all about it and the tears just come. But for me, it's never happened in fiction, which is why I asked, because and what's weird is it's not. I've read other nonfiction where people have died. Henson apparently did it for me. That was it. Brian Mazeltov, like you hit me, right? Like I don't know what it was about that. So what was it for you? What fiction? If you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
Yeah, no. John Green's Looking for Alaska. Okay. So John Green, classic. Maybe he would get mad that I call him a young adult author, but author for young adults, but who treats young adults rather seriously. Let's put it that way. And we'll hope that none of your audience hasn't read this book because I'm going to spoil it for them. But the titular character, Alaska, dies about 3/4 of the way through the book, and it's sort of choreographed, like it's sort of telegraphed, but you sort of like go into it still expecting it's not going to happen. And it was, I think it was a combination. It's the story a little bit of young love and of like finding your identity in a time that's really difficult in like young adulthood. And I think that, I was in a space where I really empathized with that idea at the time, but it's the way Green writes that scene, it's so shattering, and many books make death seem meaningful, right? heroes die heroic deaths. That their death has meaning, it has purpose.
Yeah.
Sometimes people die. It happens. And it doesn't happen for a good reason. It doesn't happen, and he does honor to that in this book. He does honor to that idea of sometimes people leave, and that sucks. And that was a moment. I mean, that was a moment where I put that book down. I actually read that scene and put that book down, and I didn't finish it for a week. I just couldn't quite bring myself to finish that piece of literature. And I reread that book reasonably often. Okay. It's one of my favorites.
I'm glad you brought up young adult books, because I've read young adult books. I've reviewed young adult books. To me, I don't like the way people look down on them, for the same reason that, like, you're going to look down on the French fry, but you're okay with the baked potato, right? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, it's what you're going to do with it. Like, and, you know, it's how you cook it, whatever. Like, it's a story, it's words. Okay, so maybe it's not super complex, or maybe it is, but it uses smaller words because we don't need to be whatever it is. I've enjoyed them. Like, to me, they're like candy. Look, and if you ignore the authors that I keep going back to, the Copelands, the Daytons, etc., there was a book within the Jurassic World canon. I don't remember the title, but it's like the story of Claire, who we meet in Jurassic World 1, who's running the park. And it's her internship with the park. And it is phenomenal. Like, it is absolutely phenomenal. And people would classify it as young adult because it's aimed at a younger audience. But if you enjoy the franchise, you enjoy the franchise. You want to read this book alongside Jurassic World and Jurassic Park, even though, you know, the movie universe is different, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I can hear all of the things, right? But like I'm not a coming of age female who's trying to figure out what's next. So this book is not speaking to me on those terms. I'm just reading it as a story that's part of a canon I enjoy. And I would put it up there with almost anything I've read over the last 5 years.
Yeah, I agree with you. I find young adult literature often very good, often just as good as the more quote unquote serious literature I read. The Shadow and Bone series by Lee Bardugo is a current favorite of mine. I'd say that I think I work with young people a lot, right? This is actually one of the things. Particularly, I work in a residential dorm setting now as a private school teacher, and I see those young people do things like fall in love. And there's a tendency, I think, of adults to write off those relationships as less meaningful than the relationships that we have.
Yeah.
Right. I'm married. Sure. I have a incredibly meaningful relationship. You know, I would be shattered if that relationship fell apart. And yet my students in many ways are just as shattered when their relationships fall apart, even though I know that in 10 years they won't think about it because it's important to them right now.
Yeah.
And so I think we devalue those stories. We say that those emotions in those stories don't matter as much. And I think that's why young adult literature gets a bad rap.
I wonder too if to me reading it seems like the harder thing to write, because when I compare, and this is the closest thing I can come that's both within kind of the same genre. When I compare, like, just generally, I read 2 Black Widow novels. Like novels, right? Not comic books. Novels that I really enjoyed them, right? It was a series, and I don't know if there's going to be a third. I just don't. But to write that in a world where Black Widow's made out with Captain America, and not like to write that and try and keep it on an even keel, right? And not immediately go for like the sexual overtones that you get from every Marvel movie, right? Or the super violence is not in those books either. Like, there's things that, from an adult perspective, if we're going to call it adult fiction, or grown-up fiction, or whatever we're going to call it, there's things we always jump to immediately when we want to make a plot more important. Oh, a love interest. They went on a date once, whatever. Like, you don't find that. You find a lot more character and just internal strife in young adult fiction. And I feel like, I don't know if I could write that. Like, it seems like you're writing with a crutch, or like writing with one arm tied behind your back. And that's just from a reading perspective. I'm sure to some people it's easy and to some people it's not, just like math, right? Or writing. Right. But to me, like, I go, well, this is really well done, because they don't have to just jump to whatever.
Yeah, they're constrained by the plot devices that they're able to use. And I love that sense of internal strife. I at least feel like often young adult fiction deals with emotion in a much deeper way, because those are sometimes the levers on which they turn the plot, right? You can't go to, right, these dramatic sort of, scenes of violence or things like that. So you need the drama to be emotional in many ways. And that, to me, is so fascinating. And I can't imagine, I don't know, I have a hard time empathizing with teenagers. I can do it, right? But, like, I don't know their internal emotional life. I am so impressed by folks that can write those things realistically, because that has to be hard. I don't know how you do that well.
I think the other part of it is, and it tends to be more of a joke the older you get. But it tends to be more of a joke the actual age when it increases. But what is your internal age? Like, when you think, like, because here's the thing. So I went for a run today, and I'm still comparing myself to 16-year-old me, right? In my mind, I might as well just be 18, not an almost 40-something that has a mortgage, right? Like, that may be the truth of my situation, but it is not how I think of myself internally. And I feel like it's one of those things that reading does, is like, oh, I can, when I read the young adult stuff, it's not hard for me to put myself right in there, because I don't feel that much. Look, I am actually super old compared to these characters, but in my mind's eye, I am not.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting that we can do that, right? I always feel like my internal age bounces around a little bit. So it's so interesting to me that sometimes in certain situations I feel much younger, like I'm playing League of Legends with friends of mine, right? That feels like a younger version of myself. And then sometimes some kid asks me, like, advice about, like, choosing colleges, and all of a sudden I feel every minute of my age, right?
Yeah.
Because I feel like I have to marshal all of those years to give good advice. And so it's so fascinating to me how contextually I can feel different ages. Contextually, I can feel like, here I feel much older than this other position where actually I feel a lot younger. I feel like I'm in a lot of a younger position. And literature does that to me. Reading does that to me.
So I want to get back to the math for a second. As much as we could probably talk books for the rest of the night. Right. Much less the episode. I did want to ask, do you have a I don't know what the language is, so I'm just, gonna, like, is there a piece, a section, an area, I guess, of math that you super enjoy? And conversely, what do you not like? Because clearly you have to have, like, I love this about math and I don't like this. You cannot possibly like all of it.
I certainly don't like all of math.
Okay.
Let's put that right out there. I am certainly not a huge fan of all of math. I think I have two answers for math that I enjoy. I was, when I was pursuing a PhD, before I made a different choice there, I'm an abstract algebraist, which writ large is sort of this sense of systems and the rules that they play by. Let's put it that way. So you have these sets of objects. They might be numbers, they might not be. and you can impose certain rules about how they add together, how they multiply, whether they have to have inverses, whether they have to have objects that multiply to make one, whether they have to have a zero where if you add it to an object, you get the same object, right? All of these rules. And sort of abstract algebra is sort of the theory overlying all of these ideas. And to me, it was such a visual way of thinking about things. I would be on the bus. This was a thing. People might look at me like I was crazy. I'd be on the bus and I'd be thinking about sets, and I could see sort of the maps or the functions between these two sets and what they did, and sometimes they were very physical, like how they rotated objects or things like that. And so certainly that's beautiful, and I loved that from a theoretical standpoint. I would say my current love, the love that I share with students often, is statistics. I think we should talk to everyone about statistics more often. And I'm a political junkie. Unfortunately, it's probably not good for me, but I stay glued to 538 and the forecasting websites and the folks that are doing really fascinating work about how to understand the sort of important, powerful forces of our life in a statistical manner. And so I really enjoy seeing how that's so useful. That's certainly a piece.
And what is it that you dislike?
Yeah, so I am not very well spatially oriented. Let's put it that way. Backing up my car, I'm really glad that backup cameras come standard on cars that you buy these days. And so geometry for me is really, really difficult. Okay. And so I can do it. Don't get me wrong. I am perfectly capable of doing geometry, but it doesn't come naturally. That involved a lot of work. And I still, students will often say, like, I thought you'd just see this answer. And I'm like, no, I got to write this out. Right? Like, I got to diagram this out because I just don't have a good sense of it. And so that to me is difficult. And it was certainly the part of math that I did not enjoy. And I still struggle with.
So I think I'm gonna make an assumption, right, that the listening audience can figure out a career path for a statistician, right? I think we can all figure that out, right? Whether it's political forecasting or, now the big thing would be baseball now that, or sports in general. I think I'd say sports in general now that betting is legal across this country as it was elsewhere. But abstract algebra, ignoring the idea of becoming a professor, okay, what is a career path had you continued down that road?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there are a lot of them. And I think that it's really fascinating to consider what folks, when you leave academia, people sometimes speak of you as if you're dead, like they went to the industry. This is a common phrase that people use. But there's some really fascinating work you can do. So part of abstract algebra has to do with like rotations of symmetry. So what ways can you rotate an object? And what does that do to the points of the object? Like how does that reorient it in space?
Okay.
So you imagine when you're thinking about robotics and you're thinking about like engineering in factories, and you want to think about efficient movement of robotic arms and how you might move those objects through, a process or a system, you might think that someone that really understands the mathematics of that would be really helpful. And certainly that's a type of career. There's folks that work in crystallography, which again has this like sort of symmetry idea here. If you're looking at crystals or you're trying to create like crystalline structures, there's a lot of symmetry that goes on there. The most fascinating person, and this is maybe my last thought here, is I met someone when I was working on the Syracuse University master plan. So they were replanning the campus at Syracuse when I was a graduate student there. And the guy that led that team was a kind of combination abstract algebraist graph theorist. And he did this incredible analytical work about space. And he asked these sorts of questions. He sent this survey out to the whole community. And he said, okay, click on a couple places on campus that you think are really important. You go very often. And then map the routes that you take between those places. And then he did this whole analysis about kind of the most important aspects of campus and where they were and how people got from place to place. And it was fascinating and was really helpful in reimagining, like, where would you put buildings if you got to move them? Where would you build new buildings if you had to build new buildings? And that was fascinating. So there's lots of applied work that you actually can do here.
Okay.
If you're imaginative about it.
All right. It's one of the things that I find very interesting about academia in general is that I think you're right. I think the more people I talk to in academia, the more you realize that the ivy covered walls are not just around the Ivy League, right? There is very much you're on tenure track, right? Like I and not to completely self-promote, but if you listen to the story that the Tolkien professor talks about during that episode where he eventually leaves to start a brand new thing, he was an outcast. Like, he absolutely was. And he stayed, it's a different form of higher education, but he stayed in higher education and he's still an outcast, right? Like, it is amazing to me that exists. And here I am, thinking, like, there was a time I wanted to be a teacher. And the more I talk to people, the more I think, yeah, maybe not. And I want to say this. We do need good teachers. We need more good teachers. Probably because at some point, maybe this is wishful thinking. At some point, someone will actually figure out, yeah, maybe 50 students to a teacher, not a good idea, right? Like, at some point, somebody's going to figure that out. I don't know how it happens, but in that world where that's a fact, we need more teachers, because you're not just going to be like, all right, well, I'll just hire four times as many. Like, they're just not going to exist. And teachers, I guess, like politicians, like, a good one is rare. Like, there's plenty of people that are they're not bad people. Okay. I don't want to go on that road, but they're not great at the job. They just feel it's easy. And I went to high school with a lot of those current teachers. I went to high school with a lot of people that were like, I'll just be a teacher. Like, you, Sam, I could tell, like, you're passionate about it. You want people to learn. But to me, the former classmates I had that are like, yeah, I'll just be a teacher. That's not somebody who's inspired. It's not somebody who's inspiring the next generation. And I guess I'll run for Congress is not somebody who's actually going to change the world, right? Like, so we do need those things, but, like, I want to get back to what you do in your spare time, because in your spare time, you are also teaching aside from reading and, family stuff. And you're teaching on Twitch to the general populace. I don't know what, whatever the Twitch audience happens to be. So I want to ask, where does that come from? Because, like, you could have just been like, I want to help people, I'll offer tutoring, or, whatever, to do it on a public forum is a different, I don't know, that's a different idea.
Yeah, so it came from two places. One of which, at least, is very self-centered, which is the person I do it with, John, is a really good friend who I felt like I didn't see enough. So half of the Math Prof story is all about friendship, right? It's about the fact that I wanted to hang out with John, and I wanted an excuse to do so, and a rather regular excuse, right? And so I proposed, why don't we start a Twitch channel where we're going to talk about math? Like, why don't we just talk about math and play video games, because everyone likes playing video games, but talk about math. And John was down for it pretty quickly. And sort of my pitch was, when I taught at college, most of the people that I got had already decided, maybe similar to you, whether or not they were math people. They had made a choice, or maybe that choice had been made for them. I don't want to put that agency entirely in their hands.
Sure.
That either math was their thing or it wasn't. And that is so unfortunate to me. It cuts off so much of the world from you. And so sort of the pitch was, can we bring it back? Can we convince you, at least for, 30 minutes during a Twitch stream, that you can understand this and that you might want to understand this? And so not only were we really working very hard to make it understandable, but to pick good problems that folks might care about. So, we talked about gerrymandering. We talked about ELO, about the way that video games rank your level of skill, because those were problems that folks might actually think meant something to them. And if we could convince them that not only did it mean something to them, but they also understood it, we might break through that shell of, hey, math isn't for me, and get a little bit further down that path.
I feel like this might be too... Actually, I don't think this is too much. It's a noble effort, right? Like, because I think that one of the things about Twitch, which is the same as YouTube and blogging or podcasting or anything, is you can't measure impact. You can measure engagement. There's somebody in your chat that's like, oh, thank you, I get it. But you're probably going to reach more people who are sitting there and the light bulb goes off, they nod their head, and then they go, okay, I got that. And you just can't judge that impact because we have no way of doing that, right? Like, you and I could be doing this live in front of an audience, and we still wouldn't know who in the audience we reached that's going to go back and either try and discover a little bit more math or maybe going to read based on our conversation. You can't judge that. So how is that for you? Because when you're in the classroom, you can you don't actually know, but you can kind of see it in the body language because there's not 100,000 people there. Is it easy or harder to kind of teach into that vacuum?
It's in some ways freeing because you can just present and do the best you can. And right, there's this level of anxiety in teaching to a group of real physical people whose expressions you can read, where you realize like, oh, no one understands, right? And that level of anxiety does not happen in Twitch chat unless someone like chats and says, hey, I don't get what's going on, and then we have a conversation. But most of the time, you don't get that. So in some ways, it's freeing, right? Like, you know that you're presenting and you're going to be hopeful, and it might have an impact or it might not. On the other hand, getting good feedback about like, was this understandable or not is really hard. And so for somewhat, that's like reaching out to those folks that we do know that are in chat and getting a little bit of like, oh, did you understand that? And getting some of that feedback. And some of that's just hope, right? I'm an expert and I'm hoping I'm making things understandable. And also, I'm well aware that when I talk about the mathematics of gerrymandering, you might not understand like 50% of what I say. But if you do understand the beginning 50% and you read a New York Times article about gerrymandering like 5 weeks later, you might remember Sam said this thing. And that's enough for me. It's enough for me that that's what you remember and that's what you recall, and that was useful to you and that helped you understand.
I think everybody needs that inkling, right? Like, because that's where it starts, whether it's high school, higher education, or just like a conversation you heard or a lecture you attend. That first 50%, that's the hook. Because if you understand it, when it pops up in your real life in some way, you go, oh, wait, I want to know more, right? Like you immediately go, yes, give me more of that. I want to understand that better.
Or, and right, you absolutely do that. And I think the other thing you do, and this is actually a really important goal for me, and it's something that we've done a little bit on the Math Profs, and I want to do more, is you equip people to ask the question, right? Unfortunately, a lot of times on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or even in standard news sources, this number floats across your page and you have no clue whether or not it's legitimate. You just don't know. And you don't know whether it's being phrased in a certain way. But if I can do enough to convince you of they might not be telling you the truth, or at least they might be telling you the truth in the way that they want you to hear the truth. You start to ask that question. And that's when you do that extra research, right? You do that extra research to say, hey, was it legit when they said that 50% of people believed blah, blah, blah? Or is it really a little more complex and they're really just trying to make a narrative point? And that's the other piece, is not only engage that interest, but engage that sense of like healthy skepticism that makes, like this is maybe pie in the sky, but like makes healthy democracy work, right? Like healthy society works when people ask questions and try to understand for themselves what they're being presented. And that's absolutely a goal that I've had for a long time, because I think it's so important and it's so missing in our conversation, particularly about like mathematical literacy.
I love the fact that Sam is fighting against the stigma that math isn't for me. Because despite all of the blubbering about math that you either get it or you don't that I said, you can learn how it is applicable or even beneficial to your life. In the same way that one of the underlying themes to this podcast, not just this episode, but this podcast as a whole, has been that everybody should read. And again, when it comes to reading, you will find the argument that reading just isn't for me. But like math, reading is for everyone. But you have to make the effort if it doesn't come naturally. If you don't make the effort, then of course you'll never understand math. And then you'll never understand physics. And then you'll never understand the fabric of the universe. But perhaps it's just as simple as understanding math is understanding how the polling that happens before elections works. It's understanding how Amazon Web Services comes up with those win percentages that now show up in every sport. You don't just have to take the computer's word for it. You can find out how the computer or the mathematician behind the computer arrived at that number. And again, you can make yourself a reader. Plus, as Sam and I discussed, a book is a book is a book. Just because you're almost 40 doesn't mean you can't read a young adult book. And just because you're a teenager doesn't mean you can't read something that isn't. Expand, learn, and then keep on. Education in or out of the classroom should be a lifelong passion. It is for me. It is for Sam. How can we help foster learning as a lifelong passion for you? Let us know. Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files, episode 57. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes. And now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can tweet me at Agent Palmer, my guest Sam Leiterman at Sam Leiterman, that's SamLeitermann, and this show at the Palmer Files. You can watch Sam along with John on Twitch as The Math Profs at twitch.tv/themathprofs. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. All right, Sam, do you have one final question for me?
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite questions, and it really goes back to our reading. I love to ask people this question. If you could erase your brain of the memory of one book so that you could read it again for the first time, you got to re-experience in all of its glory one book, what would it be? And like why? What would that experience be for you?
The Great and Secret Show by Clive Barker. And it's the reason that while I have reread some of his stuff, I reread Galilee so I could write about it. I reread Weave World and The Thief of Always, and I plan on rereading a few other things. And I read the sequel to it, Everville, for the blog, right? But The Great and Secret Show is one of those books that I would love to erase my mind and read again for the first time, for the same reason I don't know if I want to reread it. Because I have such a reverence for that book, because for a fantasy book to go that heavy in philosophy without losing me, and still have the elements of like maybe magic, hyper fantasy, and realism all kind of mashed into one, it just, and maybe it was the time. Maybe it was when I mean, look, I will be the first to admit some of these things are a product of you. A book is never a one-way street. So where you are matters a great deal into where you are as far as enjoyment of that book or understanding or compassion for the characters. But I've been searching for a very long time. I think I've always been searching. And so The Great and Secret Show I read at a time when I was definitely looking for something more. And that's a book that talks about the something more. Is there something more? What is there? And the metaphysical parts of that book, I still remember, right? But I don't want to just reread them. I think I would want to, and you know, maybe I'll change my mind, because I do hold it in such high regard. Like, will it hold up after, I don't know, I read it a decade ago? Does it still mean something to me as a person who's still searching? I don't know, but that's the book that, bar none, that's the one I would want to go back and experience for the first time.
That is incredible. And
have you read that book, by the way?
I have not. It's on my list now.
Okay. Yeah, it is. So when I come to Barker through a book called Galilee, which is fantasy through and through. Okay. It's Barker fantasy, but it's fantasy. It's not horror. It's not what people immediately think of. And I go from Galilee to Weave World, which is fantasy with a bit more of the horror that you expect from the guy who did Hellraiser, but it's not Hellraiser. And then I read Damnation Game, which is a little bit more of the horror aspect. Then I ended up, I don't know how I ended up with The Great and Secret Show, right? It's just, I enjoyed reading his stuff. And I was like, well, I don't want to quite go into like the Books of Blood, which was a book I owned and was ready to read. And a roommate of mine in college took it and I never saw it again. So he either still has it or he has lost it, which is fine. I now have a hardcover version thanks to that lot. But The Great and Secret Show just ends up being one of those books like, oh, well, I've liked his other stuff. This doesn't seem like the horror, because I'm not a really big horror guy. And I just picked it up, and it was just kind of like, wow, right? And then I've also read Cold Hard Canyon, which I'm very excited to reread. It's just such a dense book, but it happened so fast, I feel like I missed pieces. The Great and Secret Show, you might read it fast, but you don't experience it fast, which might be the reason for my answer, right? Like, and it's so super contradictory. For the same author, I'm like, yeah, I want to reread Cold Hard Canyon for everything I missed, but I don't want to reread The Great and Secret Show again, because like, I don't want to know what it will change of my perception of me loving that book. Even though both of those books, for the most part, are fantasy, little metaphysical, maybe a little elements of horror in there. So for me, that's the one. But I'm going to turn it on you, of course. So what is yours?
It's a great question, and Dune is the book that sort of pops like front of mind. And it's going to be either Dune or The Great Gatsby. I have a hard time deciding between the two of them. Two very different books. But I think particularly, so I read The Great Gatsby when I lived on Long Island in a Gold Coast mansion. Actually, that was the first college that I attended, was housed in one, and it was just the perfect evocative book for the perfect evocative moment.
Sure.
I really align with sort of your feelings there of like it was the right book at the right moment for the right person, right? That's where I was, and those intense feelings of loneliness that exist in that book really at that moment of my life rang true to me, and still do, but in very different ways. So no, I'll firm up my answer. I think The Great Gatsby would be the book that I would choose not to. No, I will say I got a little bit of a taste of this experience, so I can report a little bit from the other side. I'm married to someone who is not from the U.S., and so the U.S. canon was not part of her childhood experiences. And so when we were first dating, I read The Great Gatsby with her.
Okay.
And so I got to experience a person ask all the questions about a book that I love, that I could tell you, page by page, because she didn't have any of the context that I have, and that was a really fun experience. I will say that was the best way to reread that book, was with a person who hadn't read it before.
I'm going to have to consider that. Wow.